What happens inside a soldier's mind when victory turns into defeat? What if those who were supposed to command hope instead felt only dread? In this story, you'll hear how the generals of Nazi Germany, once confident, invincible, came to realize in silence and terror that the war was already lost. But recognition did not bring salvation, it brought despair. Stay with me, because their inner journey reveals more than battlefield errors. It reveals betrayal, fear, and the collapse of faith, the zenith of power. In the early months of the war, no one spoke of failure. The generals of Germany rode high on wave after wave of success. In just a few years, Hitler's armies had conquered Poland, Norway, France, Belgium, and much of the Balkans. The doctrine of fast, precise war, blitzkrieg, had seemed unstoppable. To many officers, these victories were proof. Their doctrines, their training, their pride, they had all been vindicated. The generals felt they stood on the summit of power. The world trembled at their advance. Then June 22nd, 1941 came. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Armored columns roared eastward. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal von Bock, surged deep into Russia's heart. Soviet cities fell, and prisoners poured in. Many in the general staff believed the collapse would be swift. Yet beneath the roar of tanks and cheers from command, a quiet unease began to grow. Whispers in the mess hall, in the officers' messes and private letters home. Faint murmurs began. At first, they were jokes. Can we really push all the way to Moscow before winter? But soon, they turned serious. Some generals, veterans from the First World War, recognized patterns. The front was becoming too wide. Supply lines stretched beyond endurance. Fuel convoys lagged. Motorized units outran their support. Infantry lagged behind. In staff rooms, maps would lie open, red arrows pushing farther and farther, while thin black lines struggled to keep them supplied. Still, in public, no one said a word. They obeyed orders. They led their troops forward, but in private, their confidence cracked. The food got worse. Supplies dwindled. The cold started to kill more than enemy fire. Radios froze, machines jammed. The men in the field called it the silent enemy, the war against nature, distance, exhaustion. By November 1941, German columns ground to a halt. The Red Army, battered but unbroken, launched a counterattack toward Moscow. The front buckled. In dugouts and field headquarters, officers huddled over maps. The whisper of defeat became audible, at least to them. The winter that broke them. Winter in Russia is an unforgiving beast. Temperatures sank below -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, weapons jammed, boots cracked, men's fingers blackened. Frostbite claimed thousands. The Wehrmacht, built for fast war, was not built for frozen war. The deep snow, the mud, the endless forests, they turned mobility into misery. The generals realized they had underestimated everything about Russia besides its vastness. Reserves were too few. The promised reinforcements were delayed. The Germans could not match Soviet recruitment or replacement. The front lines, so expansive, had holes in them. Lines were thin, stretched, vulnerable. Some generals began to think maybe all these advances had been illusory. But mustering doubt into action was not so easy. To question was dangerous. To rebel was treason. So they stayed silent or whispered. That winter, defeat became possible in their minds. The war was no longer a short campaign. It was becoming a war of attrition. The turning point, Stalingrad. Hitler demanded bold moves to regain momentum. In 1942, his plan was audacious. Split the German drive into two axes, one toward the oil fields in the Caucasus, another toward Stalingrad. The bold gamble, cut deep, seize resources, force the Soviets to collapse. Field Marshal von Bock warned it was reckless. Splitting forces across such distances would dilute strength, expose flanks, and overextend supply lines. Hitler dismissed him. You always see black clouds. So the forces advanced, southward toward Stalingrad, but the terrain, resistance, weather, and Soviet tenacity conspired against them. Street fighting emerged. The urban jungle swallowed tanks. Supplies could not keep up. The Germans were bleeding. In November 1942, the Red Army encircled the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad. The city fell under siege. General Friedrich Paulus radioed Berlin, pleading for a breakout. None came. The Sixth Army, once the pride of Germany, was trapped in a frozen tomb. The impact rippled through the officer corps. If this could happen to Germany's finest, what hope remained? The myth of invincibility shattered. In that moment, many generals no longer merely doubted victory. They knew that defeat was coming. Kursk and the death of offense. After Stalingrad, hope flickered faintly. Germany attempted to recover. In 1943, Hitler planned a massive offensive at Kursk, a gamble to reverse the momentum. The Wehrmacht would strike the Soviet salient, break through, and regain dominance. But the Soviets had foreseen it. Massive fortifications, minefields, deep defenses, reserves. Intelligence warned that the element of surprise was lost. Some generals quietly advised against it. Still, Hitler pushed. The Germans attacked. The result: failure. Their tanks were destroyed, their spearheads blunted. The defenders held firm. The offensive collapsed. Offensive war, once their strength, was now broken. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was on the back foot. The generals no longer looked for victory. They looked to hold, delay, withdraw. Every map now showed retreat. Every plan was defensive. The D-Day shock and internal reckoning. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied armies landed on Normandy's beaches. Germany now faced a second front. The generals understood better than anyone. They could not hold both East and West. German forces were overstretched. Fuel was short. Hitler micromanaged decisions from Berlin, ordering counterattacks and defenses in hopeless places. Field Marshal Owen Ram, commander of Army Group B, walked the front line and told his staff, "The war is hopeless. Every day we prolong this is a crime." He urged Hitler to negotiate. Hitler's response: fury. When the July 20th plot to kill Hitler failed, many generals who had considered removing him were implicated. Ram chose death over trial. Others were executed. The message was clear: disloyalty would be fatal. The officer corps trembled. Any whisper of reform, any thought of ending the war, became suicidal. And yet, inside, more and more generals believed that Germany's path was destruction, collapse, and broken obedience. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Red Army pressed into East Prussia and Silesia. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine. Bombers destroyed cities by night. Supplies were cut off. Communication lines severed. Hitler still raged, issuing impossible orders. Armies non-existent were to counterattack. Cities to be defended to the last man. Civilians to be conscripted. Generals were expected to carry out fantasies. Some generals no longer obeyed. They falsified reports, ignored commands, surrendered their units. Others tried to save people, ordering retreats, preventing civilian massacres. A few remained fanatically loyal, signing the surrender at war's end. On April 22nd, in a meeting deep in his bunker, Hitler admitted the war was lost. He said suicide was the only escape. To his officers, this confession brought no relief. They had known it for years. The generals had lived through the disintegration of all they believed in: honor, discipline, the myth of German superiority. Some tried to flee, some waited for capture. Many died in the chaos. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the war was over. But for those who had commanded, defeat had begun much earlier. The silence after. After the war, in prisoner interrogations and memoirs, many generals claimed they had seen defeat coming and tried to stop it. They blamed Hitler, the party, the SS. Some even tried to portray themselves as victims. But their records told a more complicated truth. Many had continued to follow orders, prolonging the conflict. Some had personal ambitions, ideological commitment, or fear. Their complicity was real. Their tragedy was not simply that they recognized defeat too late. It was that, even when they did, they lacked the will to stop it. They surrendered in their hearts long before their armies did. From the frozen steppes of Russia to the ruins of Berlin, these men watched the world they had built collapse. Victory died not in a fiery showdown, but in the slow unraveling of faith, in the quiet moments between battles. What lessons do these silent minds leave behind? That obedience without conscience is a path to ruin. That recognition without courage is betrayal. That wars are lost not only when armies fall, but when those who command lose their souls. Now, we will hear stories of 3 generals, one who plotted to kill Hitler, one who quietly betrayed orders, and one who died insisting he remained loyal. Stay tuned as we peel back the mask of invincibility and learn how moral failure can begin in silence. Imagine a room full of generals, maps spread wide, voices low. Outside, armies roar forward. But inside, those who command begin to wonder, are we chasing a dream? In this narrative, we follow the inner journey of Hitler's generals as the tide of war turns, and they face a slow, painful realization. They once believed in invincibility. They end in despair. Listen with me as loyalty, fear, and conscience collide in the shadows of collapse. Let us begin at the height of confidence and walk into the long fall. Rising on triumph. In the spring of 1941, Nazi Germany's generals stood at what seemed like the apex of power. The Blitzkrieg campaigns had succeeded spectacularly. Poland had been overwhelmed in weeks. Norway and Denmark had fallen. Belgium, the Netherlands, France, all capitulated in a dazzle of speed and shock. The German army moved like lightning across Europe, and many believed nothing could stop it. Men like Heinz Guderian, the armored warfare pioneer, felt vindicated. Their ideas of deep penetration, rapid mechanization, and maneuver warfare were proving themselves in blood and steel. In staff rooms in Berlin, generals would point at maps and brood about future plans. The world looked open. Then, in June 1941, came the boldest stroke yet, Operation Barbarossa. 3 massive army groups, center, north, south, would sweep into the Soviet Union. The common expectation was that the Soviet regime would collapse before winter. The generals believed they were witnessing the culmination of Germany's military genius. Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, made huge advances in the early weeks, hundreds of kilometers in days. Villages, towns, cities fell. The Soviet forces retreated. Prisoners flooded in by the hundreds of thousands. It seemed unstoppable. Yet while public discourse sang of triumph, private unease began to stir. Murmurs behind the lines. In officers' mess halls, over cigars and brandy, the first quiet doubts were voiced. The war hadn't felt like romance or swift triumph for months, but the generals kept up the facade. Veterans of the Great War, men like General Gerd von Rundstedt, who had seen the horrors of prolonged conflict before, recognized danger, They noticed how the columns raced ahead, but their supply lines lagged. Motorized divisions outran fuel convoys. Infantry units staggered behind, often days late. Roads became clogged. Bridges over rivers became choke points, and transport units faced constant harassment. Generals would glance at maps with red arrows pushing deeper, while the supplying black lines thinned to threadbare. In a back room, one might hear, "We cannot sustain this advance." Another, "Winter will come before Moscow falls. Then we are lost." Still, no one said anything in public. To doubt Hitler's vision, or to question a directive, was treasonous. Yet in whispered letters home, in midnight reflections, many confided their dread. The bitter winter. As November 1941 brought the first heavy snow, the German advance began to stall. Temperatures plunged to lethal levels. Engines froze. Tracks jammed. Radios crackled with static. Then silence. Trenches filled with sleet. Boots cracked. Hands turned black with frostbite. Soldiers' wills frayed. Berlin's promises of swift victory faltered. Supply trains were delayed or destroyed by partisan raids. Truck convoys struggled over mud roads, turning into quagmires. Fuel ran dangerously low. Infantry divisions lacked winter clothing. Amid these deprivations, the Red Army struck back. In the dead of night, Soviet divisions counterattacked toward Moscow. German positions shuddered. Army Group Center encountered fierce resistance. The front became rigid, segmented, dangerous. In forward command posts and staff rooms, generals pored over maps in disbelief. The sweeping momentum had died. The war shifted from campaign to crawl. By winter's end, the war of lightning had become a war of attrition. The generals began to feel the cold in their resolve. That winter, in dim dugouts and freezing headquarters, the notion of an instant collapse of the Soviet Union seemed like fantasy. Many realized, in private, that victory was slipping away, the gamble toward Stalingrad. But Hitler would not accept stasis. He demanded strategic renewal. In 1942, he ordered a bold southern drive. Take the oil fields of the Caucasus, cut Soviet supply lines, and strike the city of Stalingrad as a psychological blow. Field Marshal von Bock and generals such as Erich von Manstein warned of overextension. Yet Hitler would hear no dissent. "You always see black clouds," he snapped. "I see only opportunity." Thus, Germany split its forces. One axis rolled toward the Caucasus, another toward Stalingrad. The plan was audacious, but fragile. The drive south was brutal. Terrain was harsh. Rivers, mountain passes, deserts. Not suited for mechanized warfare. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Troops suffered. Resupply convoys were harassed by Soviet defenders. Fuel, ammunition, winter clothing. Each was precious and scarce. Stalingrad itself became a legendary hell. The city turned into a maze of shattered buildings, ruins, rubble. Tanks moved only with extreme difficulty. Infantry fought house to house. Supplies trickled through narrow corridors. The Soviets held ground with tenacity. The Wehrmacht was bleeding. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, encircling the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus. The encirclement was a trap. Paulus radioed Berlin for permission to attempt a breakout. None was given. Hitler ordered them to stand fast. Thus, the Sixth Army was sealed. Soldiers froze, starved, fought on in ruins. The proud German army was trapped in its own folly. For the officer corps, this was a crushing blow. If this could happen to the best, what hope remained? Many more than before knew the war could no longer be won. The myth of invincibility shattered in cold dust and ruin. Kursk, the last great gamble. In early 1943, Germany attempted a final push to restore momentum. The plan was Operation Citadel, a massive assault at Kursk. It aimed to punch through a Soviet bulge and change the strategic balance. But the Soviets anticipated it. They built deep defenses, multiple minefields, anti-tank obstacles, trenches, bunkers, layered armored units in reserve. Intelligence had warned the surprise was lost. Generals such as Günther von Kluge and Erich von Manstein privately cautioned restraint. But Hitler insisted. On July 5, 1943, the Germans attacked. The clash became a vision of catastrophe. Tanks bogged in mud. Mines exploded under tracks. Anti-tank guns mowed down armor. Soviet reserves counterattacked the flanks. The German assault stalled. After days of carnage, the offensive collapsed. Germany's capacity for offense was broken. From that moment forward, they were no longer innovators. They were defenders. The initiative belonged to the Soviets. Even hardline generals admitted Germany's fate was shifting irreversibly. The front would now shrink, or be forced backward. The war was no longer winnable. It was survivable. The Western blow, D-Day, an internal reckoning. While the Eastern Front bled Germany white, the Allies prepared their strike in the West. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord commenced. Allied armies landed on Normandy. For Germany, this meant a second front, an impossible challenge. Generals on the Western Front knew they could not defend both East and West. The Wehrmacht was exhausted. Fuel was scarce. Manpower drained. Hitler, isolated and doctrinaire, issued rigid orders from Berlin. He insisted on holding the coasts, launching counterattacks, rejecting retreats, even when fronts were collapsing. Field Marshal Owen Ram, commander of Army Group B in the West, visited front lines personally. He told his staff, "This war is hopeless. Every day we delay the end is more bloodshed." He urged negotiation. Hitler raged in response. When the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler failed, the consequences were swift. Generals associated with the plot, or even sympathetic, were executed. Field Marshal Rahm killed himself before trial. Others were arrested, tortured, or shot. The message was brutal. Any trace of rebellion would be met with death. The officer corps was paralyzed. They believed the war was lost, but could not act. To speak was to die. Retreat, disobedience, and moral collapse. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on all fronts. The Red Army advanced through East Prussia, Silesia. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine and spread into Germany's heartland. Bombers pounded cities nightly. Supplies were cut. Communications failed. Hitler, in his isolation, insisted upon impossible orders. Armies that no longer existed were to counterattack. Some cities were to be held to the last man. Civilians were conscripted. Desperation reigned. Many generals refused. They falsified reports to Berlin, claiming fronts still held when they had retreated. They delayed orders. They organized retreats quietly. Some evacuated civilians. Others surrendered where they stood, rather than fight senseless battles. In April 1945, deep in his bunker, Hitler confessed, "The war is lost. I have no further path but death." To his generals, this confession held no shock. They had been living it for years. The last threads of discipline unraveled. Obedience turned to silence, then breakdown. In Berlin, the final battles raged. Generals who remained loyal signed the unconditional surrender on May 7th. Others surrendered locally. The Reich collapsed. Allies marched in. The war was over. Yet for many generals, defeat had come in slow stages, years before the final capitulation. After the silence, blame, memory, and legacy. After the guns fell quiet, the generals were interrogated, tried, or allowed to fade into obscurity. Many claimed they had always known the war was lost and tried to avert catastrophe. They blamed Hitler, the Nazi elite, the SS, the party. Some painted themselves as reluctant servants trapped in madness. But history and archives reveal complications. Many continued to issue orders that led to more death. Many had been willing participants in campaigns of destruction and occupation. Some made personal choices, loyalty, ideology, ambition, while avoiding moral reckoning. The tragedy of the German High Command is not simply that they erred. It is that, when the moment came to act differently, they did not. They surrendered, not publicly, but in private. Their faith, once absolute, crumbled in the cold of Russia. The fire of Stalingrad, the rubble of Kursk, the invasion of the West. They watched their own war collapse. They presided over slaughter. They died, surrendered, or tried to vanish. Many rationalized. Few admitted their own responsibility. In the end, Hitler's generals carried not just the weight of defeat, but the weight of silence. They knew it was lost, too late to save. And in their silence lay the essential tragedy. Recognition without courage cannot redeem. Continuing from where we left off, let's now explore the final reflections and moral reckoning that round out this story. This final segment will push the word count beyond 4,000 words, while delivering a deep emotional close, ideal for the final act of a long-form voiceover. Lessons in surrender, a quiet collapse. In war, defeat is rarely instant. It unfolds slowly, in moments unseen by the world. The surrender of Hitler's generals did not come with banners or speeches. It came in glances exchanged in bunkers, in silent nods over fading maps, in orders carried out half-heartedly, in the decision not to act when morality demanded it. By the end of 1944, many of Germany's most senior commanders no longer believed in victory, but still, they obeyed. They fought on, not out of hope, but out of habit, pride, and fear. Some clung to fantasies that the Allies would split, that a miracle weapon would turn the tide, that loyalty would be rewarded. But deep down, they knew. They had once believed they were shaping history, but history had turned on them. The fire they helped unleash now consumed everything they had built. The cities burned, the armies shattered. The country they had pledged to serve was crumbling from within. Some tried to make amends. Field commanders in the East allowed civilians to flee before Soviet troops arrived. Others surrendered early rather than sacrifice more lives. But even these gestures could not erase the years of silence, because long before the guns fell silent, long before the surrender was signed, Germany's generals had already surrendered in their hearts. The reckoning. When the war ended in May 1945, the reckoning began. The Allied forces detained many high-ranking officers. Interrogations followed. Trials loomed. Memoirs were written. Narratives shaped. In Nuremberg and beyond, the world demanded answers. How could so many experienced, educated military men have allowed such destruction to continue? When they knew it was hopeless, many replied with deflection. They blamed the fanaticism of the Nazi Party, the ruthlessness of the SS, the instability of Hitler himself. Some claimed ignorance of atrocities. Others insisted they were bound by duty, not belief, but documents, orders, testimonies. They told another story. Many generals had not only known the war was lost, they had prolonged it. In 1943, in 1944, even into the final months of 1945, when only death remained ahead, they issued commands that ensured more suffering. And so, in the shadows of victory, the victors found not just defeated enemies, but moral failures in uniforms once praised for discipline and honor. The tragedy was not only what the generals failed to do, it was what they chose to ignore, excuse, and justify, and what they did not prevent. Silence and memory. In the years that followed, many of Hitler's surviving generals lived quietly. Some published memoirs, some lived in exile, some avoided the public altogether. A few, like Heinz Guderian, remained unapologetic, claiming they were soldiers, not politicians. Others, like Erich von Manstein, painted themselves as men who only followed orders. And yet history continues to ask, what does it mean to serve a cause you know is doomed? What happens to duty when it collides with conscience? These questions echo far beyond the ruined cities of Germany or the steppes of Russia. They live in every military decision made under unjust command. They live in the hearts of those who wonder, when is obedience a crime? When is silence betrayal? The story of Hitler's generals is more than a tale of battlefield decisions. It is a story of how intelligent, strategic men allowed themselves to be trapped by belief, pride, and fear. It is a warning that the slow surrender of truth, if left unchallenged, can doom a nation, and that the moment to act with courage often comes not when the war is lost, but when it first begins to slip away. Final words. The soul of defeat. In the final moments of the war, as Berlin burned and Hitler's body lay in a bunker, many of his generals stood alone in ruins, physically and morally. Some chose death, some chose silence, a few chose to speak, but none could undo what had been done. They had believed in conquest, in control, in destiny, but they did not see that true defeat is not when armies fall. It is when ideals collapse. Germany's military elite had gambled everything on victory. When it failed them, they found themselves with nothing left to believe in. So how does defeat truly happen? Not in a single moment, not in a final battle, but in a creeping awareness, in glances exchanged in silence, in commands given with shaking hands, in loyalty maintained too long, in the quiet realization that the dream is gone and only death remains. That is the story of Hitler's generals, and that is how they lost.